Why do people destroy their own lives? What motivates them? Why is this happening? I did absolutely everything for my wife, gave her love, care, support, money, but she still decided to cheat on me. But she only ruined her life. The intercom's buzzing sound beside my bed woke me from my nap. I reached over and pressed the button. "There's a lady here who wants to see you, sir," came my secretary's voice, distorted by the machine. "I'm a bit tied up at the moment, Colette. Could you ask Val to see her on my behalf, please?" Valerie is my PA and usually handles most of my visitors these days. Truth be told, I wasn't busy at all. I'd become somewhat of a recluse, enjoying my afternoon naps. Colette knew that, so it was unusual for her to interrupt me. "The lady says it's personal and very important, sir. She insists she can only speak with you." "Damn it! Tell her she'll have to make an appointment for, sometime next week." "The lady says it's urgent and she's very insistent, sir." "Oh, for crying out loud. Fine. I guess I'll have to see her. Show her up to my office in about 5 minutes." I got out of bed, quickly splashed some water on my face in the bathroom to wake up, and then headed through the penthouse to my private office. I glanced out the window at the city below. Damn, I hate this place. I hate everything about it. Honestly, I think I hate everyone on the 17 floors beneath me too, even though they all work for me. Colette entered the office without knocking. She doesn't knock anymore, because I'm rarely in here. I'm just the figurehead of this organization now. The only reason I'm still in this penthouse suite is that I have nowhere else I want to go, and nothing I really want to do. The young woman, who Colette was supposed to be showing in, walked past her into the office with an air of authority. However, it seemed that the sudden opulence of the surroundings caught her off guard and left her a bit unsettled. I could tell she wasn't used to, and felt uneasy in, the environment she suddenly found herself in. "Mr. John Crawford?" she asked before Colette could formally introduce us. "That's me. My name's June Parsons, and I'm with Slough Social Services." I got the impression she expected me to be intimidated by this announcement. "And what can I do for you, miss? Or is it Mrs. June Parsons from Slough Social Services?" "Please call me June. We try not to be too formal." I noticed a hint of confusion on her face now. I don't think I was what she had anticipated, nor were the surroundings she was in. This woman seemed accustomed to dealing with people from a very different financial background, and here she appeared to be completely out of her element. "Very well, June. You may call me John. Now, what can I do for you?" "Oh, excuse me. Colette, you can leave Ms. Parsons with me, thank you." Colette, with a curious expression and a playful wink, turned and left the office, closing the door behind her. My visitor was undeniably beautiful, and over the years, gold diggers had come up with some pretty creative ways to reach me. "Mr. Crawford, John." "Sorry, John. I'm from Social Services in Slough. You've mentioned that more than once. Now please, how can I help you?" "Well, where do I begin?" she said, glancing around the room. The luxury of the place clearly wasn't what she had anticipated. "Look, I'm dealing with a case involving 2 children and a mother who attempted suicide. It might be easier if you read this note. It was found next to her." She handed me an envelope containing the note, though it was more of a letter than a note. I leaned back in my large swivel chair and opened it. "My dearest John," the first line read, and instantly I knew exactly who it was from. My mind flashed back 11 years, to the moment when my once happy life had come to an abrupt end. Damn, I remember that morning being an absolute disaster. A water main had burst on Chiswick High Road, causing a massive gridlock as people tried to navigate the closed-off road. I ended up being almost an hour and a half late, trying to slip into my office without anyone noticing. It was the second time that week my commute had turned into a complete nightmare. As soon as I got to my office, June, my secretary, well, not just mine, she handled work for 3 or 4 of us, stopped me. "John, where have you been, And why is your mobile off? Damn, I must have forgotten to charge it last night, I thought. It was becoming a habit lately. I was too exhausted to think straight by the time I got home. Tony Jordan's been looking for you since 9. He's got something really stuck in his craw. You'd better get up there quick. Damn it. That was just what I needed. Tony on his high horse again. Since his father retired, he and his brother thought they were the saviors of the industry. But the truth is, he couldn't negotiate a contract or keep clients happy. I wondered who he had pissed off this time. Oh, John, thank goodness you're here. I've been trying to reach you all morning. You really need to work on your punctuality, you know, Tony said as I walked into his office. Well, if you hadn't moved the office from Slough to Chiswick, I wouldn't be stuck in traffic every damn morning and evening, you pompous little prick, I thought to myself. I wished I had the guts to say it out loud. But don't we all think things like that? Sorry, Tony. There was a burst water main on the high road. Well, I managed to get here on time. Of course you did, you sneaky little bastard. You've got a pricey downtown apartment paid for by the company, just a few blocks away where you stay during the week, with that little fling your wife knows nothing about to keep you company at night. Anyway, there's a problem with the Johnson account. They're late on delivery again. I need you to fly out there and straighten things out with Johnson's board, smooth things over. They're threatening to take their business elsewhere again, and if that happens, heads will roll, not just here, but at the plant as well. You've charmed Johnson before. I'm sure you can do it again. And why aren't you going yourself? I thought. While you're at it, take that other piece of crap, your brother Robert, with you. Between the two of you, you're running this company into the ground. If your old man knew how badly you two were screwing things up here, he'd be turning over in his grave. We always think these things, don't we? I really wish I could find a good reason to say them out loud. But then, if I did, I'd be out on my ass, wouldn't I? I'll give Simon Johnson a call. I'm sure I can get him on our side. We've been doing business with him for years. No, you're flying out on the 12 o'clock flight. Old man Johnson has retired, and his nephew Paul Johnson is now the chairman. Neither Robert nor I can go. We've both got a packed schedule this week. A 12 o'clock flight? Damn, there's no way I can make it. I've got to go home and pack first. Besides, I'm supposed to take Sally to the theater tonight. She's been asking me for months. Well, you'll have to take her another time. Don't worry, the company will reimburse you for the tickets. The play ends its run on Saturday night, and Sally has been pestering me for weeks to take her. But I've been so busy getting the Carter contract sorted out that I've been coming home too late in the evenings to go. I thought that now, with the Carter contract signed and behind me, my evenings would be free for a few weeks at least. I know that the last night is sold out, and tonight was the only night we could get tickets. If I go to New York, I won't be back before Friday at the earliest. Sally is going to be furious. Well, then she'll have to go with a friend or something, won't she? Sally knows just as well as anyone that the company needs the Johnson contract. It's nearly half our turnover. You'd better call her at the factory and have her go home to pack your bag for you. You'll never make it home and back to the airport in time from here. Off you go now. We can't afford to have you miss that flight. Cheeky little brat, I thought as I left his office. I'd started working for Henry Jordan right after college. It was a pretty small operation when I joined the company. Jordan and Sons Machine Tools. Henry Jordan had gotten in on the ground floor years ago when Maggie Thatcher declared that industry had to stand on its own. When the banks started calling in company overdrafts, British engineering firms went under in droves. Henry Jordan was one of the vultures who bought up all the redundant equipment. He reconditioned it in his own little factory and sold it at outrageous profits to companies all over the developing world. Henry Jordan was a typical die-hard conservative. I suspect a lot of the profits somehow ended up in offshore accounts. After all, it wouldn't do for a good Tory to pay too many taxes, would it? When bankruptcies began to dwindle, Henry Jordan shifted the company's approach. He became an agent for companies looking to sell machine tools in Europe. It was a straightforward plan. The machinery was imported in parts, assembled, and then delivered anywhere within the EEC. The company thrived until Henry's two sons, both university graduates, joined the business. Unfortunately, they attempted to apply the just-in-time principle, which works well on a production line but doesn't allow time to resolve the frequent issues in our industry. Parts coming from all over the world could be delayed for countless reasons. Most of our clients understood these challenges, but if the brothers would only give a few extra days when quoting delivery dates, we wouldn't face half the problems we were dealing with. It always seemed clear to me, tell the customer they'll receive their order in 3 weeks, then surprise them with a delivery 5 days early. They're happy. But if you promise delivery in 2 weeks and end up being a week late, trouble ensues. And never promise what you can't deliver. I didn't quite understand why Tony insisted I fly to New York. The brothers had negotiated the latest contract with Johnson's. They should be the ones fixing it. But I knew how it would look to the board if things went wrong. I was the one who would take the blame. When I returned to my office, I called Sally at the Slough factory. Yes, Sally also worked for Jordan and Sons. That's what Tony was hinting at. It wouldn't just be my head on the line. Sally's could be too. Sally and I first met years ago when she joined the typing pool. Typing pool? Yeah, that should give you an idea of just how long ago that was. We hit it off pretty well from the start, but it wasn't until the company Christmas party that year that things really took off. You know how those parties go. Everyone was kissing under the mistletoe. When I kissed Sally, well, I'm not entirely sure what happened, but someone eventually had to ask us to move so they could have their turn. We didn't talk about it or anything. From that kiss, we were a couple. We both went a bit crazy buying each other Christmas presents, and I even joined her and her family for Christmas dinner. I think they were expecting someone else, but nobody said anything. We spent New Year's Eve together and woke up in my bed on New Year's Day. That was our first time together, though I'm sorry to admit I don't remember much about it, but I do remember the night of January 1st. Sally never actually went back home after that, and we got married 4 months later. The next 10 years were the happiest of my life, at least when I was at home. Work was going fine too, until Henry's twin sons graduated from university and joined the company. Before they arrived, I had been Henry's right-hand man, assisting him in all matters, both official and otherwise. Their arrival marked a change. Henry wasn't a bad guy. He didn't immediately put his sons above me in the company hierarchy, but they clearly resented my influence over their father. They were polite enough to me, but I could tell they didn't like the sway I held. When Henry floated the company on the stock market and made a killing, that was the only time he really disappointed me. I thought he might send a few shares my way, but he didn't. And the other thing that didn't happen, I wasn't made a director. Both brothers joined the board, but I didn't. Then Henry had that damn heart attack. While in the hospital, he asked me to keep an eye on the boys. I thought to myself, fat chance, Henry. If you'd given me some shares and a seat on the board, maybe I could have had some sway over them. Of course, I never voiced that. It was obvious to me that he wasn't going to make it. Henry retired immediately and passed away 3 months later. As soon as the coffin was closed, the boys started making changes. None of them seemed like good ideas to me, but there wasn't much I could do. They rented flashy new offices in Chiswick, and most of the admin and sales staff moved there. Tony took charge of that department, while Robert completely took over running the factory. In doing so, he inherited Sally as his secretary. She'd been the PA to the factory manager for a while, but he didn't last long because Robert was constantly on his case. I can't say I was thrilled about Sally working for Robert Jordan. It wasn't something I could pinpoint, but I never liked the way either of the brothers looked at her. Maybe it was jealousy, or maybe I just didn't really like the brothers. But I had a feeling. Sally was 5 years older than them, but she was still a striking woman, even if I do say so myself. Sally seemed to get along very well with Robert. Too well, if you ask me. I didn't suspect anything inappropriate, but since I didn't like the boys, I'd sometimes make remarks about them. Sally would always defend them, and that's where the trouble started. The reality is, as the company got busier, and I was constantly running around trying to keep customers satisfied and manage new contracts, I think Robert spent more time with Sally than I did. So, she was aware of his perspective on any issue long before they were brought to me. Now, regarding the Johnson contract and my last-minute flight to the U.S., I called Sally to break the good news to her. I'm pretty sure they could hear her reaction all the way at Chelsea football ground. It definitely left me deafened. "But you're taking me to the play tonight. You promised. Why on earth did you agree to go to New York?" This was another issue of mine. Whenever I was asked to travel somewhere, Sally somehow got it into her head that it was something I chose to do. I never understood why she believed I would volunteer for these ridiculous trips. But from our discussions, it was clear she was convinced that I did. "I didn't volunteer, Sally. Tony just ordered me to go. Surely you know about the issues with the Johnson contract deliveries. Hasn't Robert told you? There are always issues nowadays. But why do you always have to volunteer to sort them out? Especially when we're supposed to be going to see the play tonight. I'm getting tired of how you've been treating me lately. What about my play?" See what I mean? I had just told her I was being sent to New York, and she still insisted that I had volunteered to go. I'm afraid I got angry because she wasn't really listening to what I said. Honestly, Sally, I couldn't care less about that damn play. Our jobs, yours as well as mine, are at risk here, and if I can't calm Johnson's board down, the company's going to be in deep trouble with no orders. So don't blame me, because your team at the factory can't deliver on time. And that's the problem with splitting the company into two parts. It created a them vs us mentality. Unfortunately, I was on the US side, and Sally was on the them side. A recipe for disaster. Now please go home, pack that bag for me, and meet me at the check-in desk at Heathrow by 11. Please. There was a brief silence on the other end of the phone before Sally said in a controlled voice, "You'll get your damn bag and maybe a few things you didn't expect. I'm not your bloody maid, you know." Then the line went dead. Why did I react like that? Why did I yell at Sally, and why did she yell back? I knew I needed to apologize when I saw her at the airport. But that didn't happen. I was at check-in by 11 o'clock, but Sally was nowhere to be seen. 10 past 11 came and went with no sign of her. Just as the check-in desk was about to close, Sally showed up. She walked through the departure lounge as if time was on her side. "Damn it, Sally, what took you so long?" I asked sharply, my worry about missing the flight evident in my voice. But then I realized that the argument wasn't really her fault or mine. It wasn't her fault that she was disappointed about the play that night, and it wasn't helpful for us to part on bad terms. "I'm sorry, Sally. I'm just so stressed about this trip," I said, trying to kiss her, but she pulled away. "We don't have time for that. You need to hurry up and save your precious contract." Then I heard the check-in clerk say, "You need to check your bag in now, Mr. Parsons, or it won't make your flight." I turned back to the clerk and completed the check-in process. When I looked for Sally again, she was gone. "How long before the flight is called?" I asked the clerk. "Probably about half an hour, but I'd advise you not to leave the departure area." I ran in the direction Sally had come from, but she must have been moving faster when she left than she had been when she arrived. At the end of the concourse was the entrance to an enclosed bridge leading to the short-term car park. Halfway across the bridge, I glimpsed a bright yellow Lamborghini exiting the parking lot below. Through the passenger side of the windshield, I could just make out Sally's coat. I recognized the driver even though I couldn't see him, as Robert Jordan never allowed anyone else to drive his prized car. I was furious. Robert Jordan was too busy to visit New York, but he had time to chauffeur my wife around in that flashy car of his. I was seething as I made my way back to the terminal building. Uncharacteristically, I stopped by the bar for a drink. After stewing there for about 20 minutes, my flight was called, and I proceeded to the departure lounge. During most of the flight, I meticulously reviewed the contracts, searching for the loopholes Henry always included to give us some flexibility with delivery dates and other terms. However, it seemed the team had tightened those loopholes in the latest contracts. Upon arriving at JFK, I was greeted by Paul Johnson himself, along with his PA Petra, who had evidently been passed down from his uncle, and a small entourage of sycophants. I'd met Paul a few times before. He was young, much like the Jordan brothers, though I only had about 5 years on them. Previously, Simon Johnson had done most of the talking, while Paul was just another of Simon's subordinates who nodded along and laughed at Simon's jokes. Paul's overly enthusiastic welcome set me on edge, especially with the entourage of flunkies who carried my bags and laptop to the waiting limo. "We've booked you into the company suite at the WA," Paul said. "SJ was hoping to see you on this trip, but unfortunately, he's still on his world cruise. He asked me to let you know he'll catch up with you when the ship docks in Southampton." I found it quite odd that Simon Johnson wanted to meet with me. I'd always had a good relationship with him, and Henry Jordan and I had interacted with him many times over the years while dealing with his company. However, I never thought our connection was anything more than professional. Now that he was retired, why would he want to see me? Henry Jordan had always stayed at the Waldorf Astoria during his visits to New York. However, when I visited the city on my own, I usually opted for less extravagant accommodations. Paul had mentioned that the suite was the company suite, so I assumed it was just vacant. I couldn't picture the Jordan brothers spending money on a suite for me. After dropping me off at the Waldorf Astoria, Paul said he would have Petra pick me up for dinner around 7 o'clock before he and his entourage left. This trip was becoming increasingly perplexing. Ideally, I should be inviting or at least asking Paul Johnson to join me for dinner. It was around 4 in the afternoon locally. I wondered if Sally had gone to the play alone, given that she had the tickets. I called our home number, but, as expected, there was no answer. Assuming it was about 9 p.m. in London, I sent her a text, asking how she was enjoying the play and who she had gone with. When Petra arrived to pick me up, I was on the phone again. I had received no response to my text, and I thought Sally should have been home by then. The home phone was still not answering, so I left a message on the answering machine, informing her that I was heading out to dinner and would call her the next day. As I was about to leave the room, Petra snatched my briefcase from my hand and placed it back on the chair where I had originally picked it up. "Tonight is just a social event, John. Paul wants you to meet his family. He mentioned it was a shame you didn't bring your wife along." "Petra, what's going on?" I asked her once we were in the car. Petra seemed to be searching for the right words, and it took her a few moments to respond. "Paul believes that since you and he do so much business together, it would be beneficial for you to get to know each other better. He also wants you to become acquainted with everyone on the Johnson board." None of this made sense to me until I began to suspect that I might be considered for a position at Johnson and Partners, possibly being headhunted from Jordan and Sons. It seemed like the only plausible explanation for everyone's odd behavior. The meal was exceptional, with a large portion of Johnson's board and their spouses present. Later, we moved to a venue where some of the guests danced. I stayed off the dance floor due to jet lag, having been awake for several hours longer than the others. As the evening progressed, I became increasingly convinced that my headhunting theory was accurate. All the board members made a point of engaging with me and ensuring I felt welcome. Petra stayed close by, almost as if she were my personal assistant. Whenever someone approached me, she would quietly inform me of their identity and provide any necessary background. I returned to my room around 2 a.m. New York time, which was about 7 a.m. back home. There were no messages on my phone, and the reception said Sally hadn't left any messages for me either. I considered calling her but decided it was a bit too early, given that she had been out late the night before. I was abruptly awakened from a deep sleep at 11 a.m. by the clattering arrival of my breakfast, closely followed by the ever-present Petra, who once again seemed to be acting as my personal assistant. "You have a meeting with the full board at 12 o'clock. It shouldn't take too long, and afterward, Paul would like you to join him for a round of golf. Oh, you do play, don't you? Of course you do. I remember you and Henry playing with SJ. Anyway, you'll fly up to SJ's estate from the helipad on the roof right after the meeting. Oh, and Paul wanted to know how urgently you need to return to London. Well, that depends on what Paul and the board have to say about our delayed deliveries. Oh, I'm sure they'll be pleased with whatever you say. After all, you're the, well, anyway, they know and trust you. Now you'd better get going, or you'll be late for the meeting. Petra, who usually exuded confidence, suddenly seemed uncharacteristically flustered, and just as quickly she was eager to leave the room, or at least to get away from me for a while. To be honest, I wasn't fully focused on what Petra was saying because I was anxious to call Sally. I dialed her office at the factory, but my call was intercepted by the switchboard. The receptionist explained that Sally wasn't in the office that day. Fortunately for me, the receptionist was a temp and didn't recognize my voice. She didn't even bother to ask who I was. When I inquired if she knew why Sally was absent, she said she didn't know. I don't know why. Maybe it was instinct. But something compelled me to ask to be connected to Robert Jordan. She informed me that he wasn't in the office that day either. Furious, I called my home number, but once again, no one answered. Then I tried Sally's mobile, but it was switched off. Robert's phone was also off. By that point, I was completely livid. I called Tony Jordan at the Chiswick office, and when he answered, I demanded to know where the hell Robert was. I explained that there was something in the contract I needed Robert to clarify. Tony seemed to hesitate longer than necessary before responding. Oh, I believe Robert's gone down to Brighton. He's meeting with the directors of Carter's Industries today. I think he mentioned taking Sally along to take notes. You know how Tony's memory is. Bad move, you lying little scumbag. That contract was finalized by me last week. It's all signed, sealed, and delivered. What kind of nonsense are you trying to sell me? Of course, I kept these thoughts to myself. After Tony asked how things were going, I told him I'd probably have to stay a few more days to smooth things over. The moment I hung up with Tony, I called Monty Carter's secretary in Brighton. As expected, she confirmed that there were no meetings scheduled that day between Robert and her boss. In fact, she couldn't even remember them ever meeting. Just then, Petra reappeared and urged me to hurry up and get showered and dressed for the conference, so I quickly swallowed the rest of my breakfast and rushed into the shower. We arrived a bit late, but it seemed like no one noticed. A seemingly endless round of introductions followed, and then we were given a tour of the offices. It wasn't until nearly 1 o'clock that we finally made it to the conference room. I have to admit, the negotiations were a complete joke. Everyone agreed with everything I said, and they seemed more concerned about whether I was upset about anything. I got the impression that everyone shared my view that the Jordan brothers were a couple of useless idiots, though no one actually said that out loud. By that point, I was sure they were going to make me an offer I couldn't refuse, so I was a bit surprised when no offer was made. When the meeting ended, Paul and I, along with a few other directors, headed up to the roof to board the helicopter. Petra, as usual, joined us. She asked when I wanted to return to England and arranged a flight for later that day. On the golf course, I used my mobile to call my secretary in Chiswick and let her know that I'd be staying for a few more days. I wanted everyone to believe I was still abroad for a bit longer, whatever was happening back home. Petra must have overheard the conversation. Sorry to pry, John, but is everything all right? I can't help but notice that whenever you call England, you seem a bit on edge, she said with concern. I'm not sure, but something doesn't feel right over there. It's probably personal. We've known each other a long time, John. Can I help in any way? You know I can keep things confidential. Well, it would be helpful if nobody finds out that I'm flying home this evening. No one in England should know. If what I fear is happening, I want to try and catch them in the act. Oh no, you don't think your wife is… I'm not sure, Petra. We had an argument before I left, and she hasn't been where I expected her to be when I tried to call. I can't get through to her on the phone either, Maybe she's still upset with me. But I can't reach a certain man either. And someone else is lying to me. There must be a reason for that. I understand why you're rushing back now. If anyone from England tries to call you, I'll handle it. Besides Paul, I'm the only one who knows you're flying this evening. All of Paul's calls come through me, so I'll manage anyone who tries to contact you. You can return their calls on your cell, and they won't know where you are. Thanks, Petra. I should get back to the game now. While I was talking with Petra, I noticed Paul start walking toward us. I stepped away to make some phone calls. What puzzled me was that, out of the corner of my eye, I saw Petra make a small gesture with her hand when she noticed Paul approaching. Paul immediately changed his course and began talking to the other two players instead. After the game, we went to SJ's mansion for a meal, where I saw SJ's daughter, Beatrice, again. She seemed strangely uncomfortable around me that day, despite knowing her for years. I couldn't pinpoint why, but I had a feeling that these people knew something I didn't. I started to question whether I had been wrong to share my suspicions with Petra. Later that day, we flew back to the company HQ by helicopter, and Petra accompanied me to the airport. She had arranged for someone to pick up my gear from the WA. The flight back to Heathrow was uneventful until we landed. In the arrivals lounge, a steward told me there was an urgent phone call for me and directed me to a service phone. John, it's Petra. We had everyone on the phone for you last night after you left. Your wife called and I told her you were in a conference with Paul. Later, the Johnsons called separately, and I gave them the same message. Your wife called again and asked when you would be returning home. I told her I'd booked you on the Saturday evening flight. Is that okay? Thanks, Petra. That should be fine. I'll call them from my mobile later and confirm the same story. I appreciate your help. Stay in touch, John. I'll let you know if anyone else calls here. So, it seemed my wife was starting to show concern about my whereabouts. I wondered why she was suddenly so worried. I checked into the Novotel by the airport and discovered that Hertz had already delivered the car I had arranged from New York. Since I had an account with Hertz, using their service was the easiest option, though the car was booked under my personal name. Since I wasn't tired, I decided to drive by my house. Sally's car was in the driveway, and the house was dark, which was expected given that it was just after 4 in the morning. I used the call box at the corner of the road to dial the house phone. There was no answer, and the voicemail picked up. After calling 4 times with no response, I assumed Sally wasn't home. I left the car where it was and quietly walked to the house. A quick search confirmed that it was empty. I wondered what to do next, and decided the best course of action was to wait for Sally to return. I brewed a pot of coffee and settled into the lounge. I had hoped the coffee would keep me awake, but it didn't. I was awakened by the rumble of the Lamborghini's loud exhaust just before 8 o'clock. Through the window, I saw Sally and Robert get out of the yellow car and head towards the house. Come in, Bobby. It won't take me long to shower and change. Go into the kitchen and make some coffee, will you? I need something to clear my head. It was surprising. Neither of them noticed me sitting in the lounge despite the door being wide open. I suppose some people don't see what they don't expect to see. Sally rushed upstairs, and Robert went into the kitchen. I heard him rummaging through the cupboards. Then he came out and called up to Sally. Where do you keep your coffee percolator, Sal? It's on the side, she shouted back down to him. Well, I can't find it, he replied. I heard Sally coming back down the stairs. Oh, you men are hopeless without a good woman to take care of you, she said, as she walked into the kitchen. That's strange, it should be over there. I don't think I left it in the loo. Oh my God, what are you doing here? Sally, having not found the coffee percolator in the kitchen, had come into the lounge to look for it, and finally saw me. She was standing there in a revealing bra and thong, neither of which I had ever seen before. Oh, I was just waiting here for my loyal wife to come back, and now I think I'm going to shove a slimy little bastard's teeth down his throat, I said as I stood up from my chair. Both Robert and Sally looked stunned for a moment, clearly shocked since they thought I was still in the U.S. Then Robert snapped out of it and tried to escape. Unfortunately for him, our front door had an unusual and complex night latch. The lever was tricky and turned the wrong way. The more he yanked at it, the more frantic he became. I slammed him against the door and beat him up thoroughly. It seemed like he didn't even know how to defend himself. Sally was screaming that it wasn't what it looked like and trying to pull me away from Robert. I didn't beat him up as much as I would have liked. Honestly, I'm not naturally violent, so when he curled up on the floor, I stopped hitting him. Some people might have taken the chance to keep attacking, but that wasn't something I could do. I turned the latch the right way, opened the door, and pushed him outside. Without thinking, I grabbed Sally and shoved her out as well. I slammed the door shut and went back to the lounge, this time heading for the liquor cabinet. Sally banged on the door and rang the doorbell for a while. Through the lounge window, I saw Robert, who had retreated to his car, get out again with a travel blanket, probably to cover Sally's nearly naked body. Sally called through the letterbox again, claiming it wasn't what it seemed and begging to be let back in. I refused to argue with her, so I ignored her pleas. By that time, some of the neighbors had taken an interest in our little scene. I could see them observing from their front doors and gardens. Sally, I assume, figured I was back in the lounge, so she redirected her attention and began banging on one of the lounge windows, still shouting at me to let her in. Unfortunately for her, she must have hit the window a bit too hard. Just as the police arrived, the window pane shattered, and Sally cut her arm quite badly on the shards. It seemed like only moments later that the paramedics and ambulance arrived. I assume the police must have called them. I didn't. Then a policeman knocked on the door. I had seen him speak to both Sally and Robert before he did so. "Good morning, sir. Can you give me your version of this little incident?" he asked. "I caught my wife with a jerk. Do I need to say more?" "Not really, sir, but the man says you hit him." "I did, wouldn't you? He was in my house." You didn't hit your wife." "No, I didn't. I just helped her through the door so she could be with her boyfriend. I thought I was being quite generous." Another officer who had been speaking with Sally and Robert came over, shaking his head at the first officer. He doesn't want to press charges, and the lady says there was no violence directed towards her. Then he turned to me. "That's quite a nasty cut on your wife's arm, sir. The medic says she'll need stitches, so they'll be taking her to the hospital, but she'll need some clothes. Will you bring some for her?" "Not a chance. That's her problem, not mine anymore. Let her little scumbag boyfriend buy her new clothes. He's got plenty of money." "I understand. But she needs clothes. She can't walk around like this. She's almost naed." "Well, she'll just have to find someone else to come and retrieve them for her, won't she? You can go get some if you'd like, or maybe her boyfriend will want to come back for another round." My attention was drawn to the Lamborghini driving away, following the ambulance. "Looks like she chose to do without. If you'll excuse me, officers, I need to call the window repair service and my lawyer." The officers left after mumbling about hoping they wouldn't need to come back later. I called the window repair service, and a technician arrived within minutes to replace the broken glass. He tried to make small talk while working, but soon realized I wasn't in the mood for conversation. My lawyer transferred me to a colleague who specializes in divorces. She said she'd start the process but couldn't do much until we knew who Sally would have representing her. It all depended on how Sally decided to proceed. I noticed the police driving by several times in the morning while I was sorting Sally's clothes, which I'd put in trash bags, into the garage. I had to assume there was some sort of collusion between the police and Sally. They must have informed her that I had put her belongings in the garage. Around 4 in the afternoon, a different police car pulled up outside the house with only one officer who didn't get out. Soon after, a Ford Transit van driven by one of the factory workers arrived and backed into my driveway. Using the remote control, I opened the garage door, and it was clear what they were there for. Sally, with her arm in a sling, got out of the passenger seat with one of her office colleagues. As the guy and the girl loaded Sally's belongings into the van, I heard Sally trying the service door between the garage and the kitchen. Finding it locked, she came around and rang the front doorbell. "John?" John, I need to talk to you. You've got it all wrong. Nothing happened between Robert and me. John, can you hear me? I know you're in there. Please, talk to me, John. Let's sort this out. You're making a huge mistake, Sally called through the mail slot. I opened the door, but before she could say anything more, I thrust her handbag into her hand and slammed the door shut again. I had already taken out her credit cards and house keys. I watched as Sally spoke with the police officer who had just gotten out of his car. He kept shrugging and shaking his head. After a while, with a resigned expression, he pointed to a spot on the ground, presumably telling Sally and her friends to wait there, and then came up to knock on the door. Your wife wants to speak with you, sir, and you know you can't keep her out of the marital home, he said when I opened it. You can tell her we have nothing to discuss. The house is already on the market because she decided it's no longer our marital home. If it were, she would have been here last night when I got home instead of being with her boyfriend elsewhere. Have her lawyer contact mine. She knows who they are. The officer walked back down the driveway and had a brief but animated conversation with Sally and her friends. Sally then seemed to collapse into the arms of her two friends, who helped her back into the van. They drove away, while the police officer stood there shaking his head, watching the garage door slowly close. With a shrug to a neighbor who had been watching, he got back in his car and drove off. About an hour later, Petra called me. I recounted the day's events to her, and she expressed her sympathy. She inquired about my plans, and I told her I intended to divorce Sally, and naturally, that I wouldn't be able to continue working for Jordan's. Petra insisted that I must keep in touch with her and made me promise to do so. She also mentioned that Simon Johnson would be contacting me and emphasized that I needed to stay in touch so he could locate me. Paul had mentioned this already. I wondered what was so crucial about Simon Johnson's visit. By the time I returned to the Novotel, it was midnight. I couldn't bear to stay in that house again. It was filled with too many memories. The next morning, after breakfast, I called my secretary, June, to see if Tony was in. She told me he wouldn't be in the office that day and asked what was going on. I told her directly, and she seemed very upset, almost crying, as I explained. She informed me that Tony had mentioned I would probably resign upon my return. It seemed he had stayed away from the office just to avoid being there when I showed up. Tony's absence struck me as odd. Given that I had had a confrontation with his brother, I would have expected him to take pleasure in firing me. After all, Robert is a company director, and there was no love lost between us. None of this made any sense. Everything felt completely baffling. First, there was the trip to New York. Tony had insisted I go, but when I arrived, Johnson's team seemed somewhat surprised by my presence. Yes, there were some delays, but they didn't appear to be overly distressed about them. Then there was Robert pursuing Sally. Sure, she's an attractive woman, but Robert had a bit of a reputation with women and always seemed to have some young, pretty girl on his arm. Sally was at least 5 years older than him and nearly 10 years older than the women he usually went after. I don't know. Maybe they did fall in love. They did spend a lot of time working together, but somehow I doubted Robert would have done that. I went to the office to collect my personal belongings. I took the chance to erase the hard drive on both my company computer and the laptop I carried, but not before copying the contents onto zip drives. I handed my resignation letter, which June had prepared for me, to the personnel officer myself. While I stood there, he arranged for my final salary and bonuses to be deposited into my bank account immediately. The accounts department was a bit hesitant at first, until they realized who was resigning. Almost all of the staff either helped me carry my things down to the rental car or came out to see me off. I had left my company car securely locked in the garage at home. I wanted to make sure I received everything I was owed before returning it. That was pretty much it. I stayed at the Novotel for about a week until I found an apartment I liked. The house sold quickly. It was in a desirable area, and I set the price for a fast sale. As for work, I decided to take a few months off to figure out my next steps. Honestly, I was still expecting an offer from Johnson's, so I didn't want to commit to anything else too soon. Sally? I saw her a couple of times. Both times we had intense arguments. To be precise, I called her a little lying girl of easy virtue, and she responded in kind. It seemed like a civil conversation between us was impossible. I was surprised she didn't move in with Robert right away. She only moved in with him a few months after I kicked her out of the house. I have no idea whose place she was staying at in the meantime, but the investigator I hired said she moved in with Robert right after our first major argument at the solicitor's office. They nearly had to call the police to break it up. She probably realized at that point that there was no chance of us getting back together. Our second confrontation was when we signed the divorce papers. Sally, looking rather odd, was already seated at the table when I entered the room. She was wearing a big winter coat and sitting in a strange way. My solicitor and I sat across from her as the details of the settlement were read out, and then Sally signed the papers. When the documents were placed in front of me and I was about to sign, Sally asked, "John, are you really sure you want to do this? There are some things you really need to consider." I turned to my solicitor and said, "Did you hear some lying little girl of easy virtue say something, Sandra?" Sally went ballistic, calling me all sorts of names, so I quickly signed the papers and left the room without saying another word. As I've mentioned before, I had no desire or need to get into a shouting match with her. A few weeks, maybe a month or so after the divorce was finalized, Petra called to inform me that Simon Johnson would be arriving in Southampton that weekend. I arranged to meet him at a hotel in town. After we got through the initial awkwardness, Simon and his wife chatted with me about their cruise for a while. Once again, I got the sense that he was up to something. Simon had just been a client I'd known for years, but now he was acting like an old friend. We went through the usual condolences about Henry's death, and he expressed his regret about what had happened between Sally and me. He also mentioned that he was really sorry he couldn't have intervened earlier, but had to respect Henry's wishes. That comment made it clear he had been avoiding the topic. But all of that changed when Bea entered the room. She greeted me with a hug and a kiss on the cheek as usual, then handed Simon the briefcase she was carrying. Bea and Simon's wife left the room before he opened it. "All right, John, let's get down to business. What did you think when Henry floated the company and didn't give you any shares?" he asked suddenly. I wasn't sure how to respond. "Well, it was his company, and he could do what he wanted with his money," I said. "But you helped him build it. Knowing Henry, I bet you went out on a limb for him more than once." I didn't respond to that. I figured he'd get to the point soon enough. "Did you know that Henry owned a significant portion of Johnson's through offshore holding companies? And those same companies also hold a considerable share of Jordan's." This was news to me, but I figured it was best to keep quiet and listen to what Simon had to say. "So, what did Henry tell you when he retired? He knew he didn't have much time left." "He asked me to try and keep his sons in line, but since I wasn't on the board, I had no real chance of doing that." Yes, I hate to say it, but he did that deliberately. He expected the boys to bankrupt the company within a year or so and didn't want your name on the paperwork. He thought they might try to pin the blame on you. You do know that if a company goes bankrupt due to mismanagement, the directors can be banned from holding other directorships, right? Anyway, he expected the boys to drain the company dry sooner or later. Now, these documents here make you the main shareholder of those holding companies. Essentially, they belong to you. Simon placed a stack of papers on the table. "And these documents here detail all of Henry's numbered bank accounts. I was supposed to keep all of this until after Jordan and Sons collapsed, but considering what the brothers did to you, I think it's better if you have them now. Did you know that according to their father's will, the brothers couldn't fire you? Ah, I see you didn't. I think those bastards set you and Sally up so you'd resign." He leaned back and looked at me. "You know, John, you're a very wealthy man now, though all your money is in offshore accounts, so you'll need to figure out how to bring it back into the country legally. I can show you a few tricks for that. I've got some very creative accountants." My mind was racing. He had just told me that Robert Jordan had seduced Sally and destroyed my life, solely to force me out of the firm. But why? You seem upset, John, and I don't blame you. The truth is, Henry was never entirely sure the boys were his. Martha had a history of affairs while Henry was away working. He had some DNA tests done years ago, and although he initially convinced himself he was their father, he eventually believed that the boys knew the truth. He also found out that they spoke ill of him behind his back. Henry always said you were more like a son to him, so he decided to leave all his money to you. He feared the boys would ruin the firm. I suspect he wants them to end up bankrupt and penniless, just as you probably do now. But what about the staff at Jordan's? They'll all lose their jobs. Not if a big American company steps in and takes over. Do you see Henry's plan now, John? Johnson's will terminate its contracts with Jordan's within the next week or so. Then, shortly after, some of the offshore stockholders will flood the London market with Jordan's shares, causing the price to plummet. A hint will be given to the right bank directors, and they'll call in the company's loans. A consortium will then move in to buy up what's left from the banks. I'll leave it to you to figure out who will be leading that consortium and becoming the main shareholder, though no one will know about that part. You, of course, will renegotiate the contracts with Johnson's. Maybe down the line, you'll even invite me to join your board. Eventually, a merger between Johnson's and Jordan's could land you a seat on Johnson's board as well. How does that sound to you, John? I don't get it. Why didn't Henry just leave the company to me outright? And then you'd be tied up in legal battles over the will for the next 20 years. You were with Henry almost every day of his working life in recent years. You know he was a bit eccentric. He was sure the family would accuse you of exerting undue influence over him. They were convinced he had money stashed abroad somewhere. They've spent a lot of money over the years searching for it. That's why Henry entrusted it all to me. Anyone looking into the source of your money will see that it comes from me. And since I'm no longer connected to Johnson and Partners, they can't accuse us of insider trading. Plus, I've been on that damn ship for the past 6 months. So here we are. I've now become the co-chairman at Simon Johnson Associates. I've left Paul in charge of the American branch while I focus on the operations in Europe. Both of the Jordan brothers went bankrupt and are barred from being directors of any company for the next 10 years. They've made a few attempts to start something new, but I've had people keeping a close watch on them. To my surprise, Robert ended up marrying Sally. I suspect he thought she might gain access to some of the money he likely believed would come my way. But since that money officially became mine after Sally and I divorced, he didn't stand a chance. After they got married, I went to court to end her alimony, so they didn't get anything from me. Their marriage didn't last more than a year. Honestly, I felt sorry for the twins Sally had with him. I figured they were probably hooking up in the office after I kicked her out, as the guy I had watching her said they rarely met in the evenings. I doubt that Robert ever paid her any support after he left. You know, these things run through your mind. I wondered how many years Robert had been messing around with Sally in his office. She must have gotten pregnant pretty quickly after we split up. I saw her pushing a pram down Slough High Road just a year after I kicked her out. The last I heard, Robert was living somewhere in southern Spain, with the Prohibited Substances Squad keeping an eye on him. Southern Spain, Morocco, it's a short trip by fast boat. I imagine that's what Robert was thinking too, which is why I tipped off the Prohibited Substances Squad. As for Tony, it seems he's now driving buses around London. Not exactly the best place for that job. His wife divorced him after she found out about his little roommate. No points for guessing who gave her that tip. And of course, Tony's mother, Martha, is living with him now. Do I feel guilty about Martha losing her income from Jordan and Sons? Well, the real question is whether Martha felt guilty about cheating on Henry. You tend to get what you deserve. The last I heard, Sally was living in a council flat in Slough, probably relying on social welfare. Who knows, maybe she's even doing something on the side. Sorry, that was harsh, but that's how I feel. Things moved quickly once we got the ball rolling. Paul and I worked well together. After all, we were both trained by the best. Henry Jordan trained me, and Simon Johnson trained Paul. Over the next few years, we absorbed other companies completely. Merging the two companies turned us into a big multinational. Paul and I have since stepped back a bit and let the team handle most of the stress. Simon Johnson and his wife settled in England. He has a nice estate next to mine. His daughter, Bea, and I hang out together sometimes. No, we're not looking to get married. Been there, done that. Bea is on the board with Paul, Petra, and me. We all get along just fine. And yes, Petra. What did you expect? Paul's wife died in a car accident years ago. After dancing around it for a while, he married Petra. Paul says she only married him because she got tired of waiting for me to propose. So, you might wonder why I'm living in this penthouse all by myself. Well, there's something missing in my life and has been ever since. Well, you know when. I kind of just take things day by day. If an opportunity comes up to make a lot of money, I'll go for it. But there's got to be more to life than just making money. Just then, the social worker handed me a letter from Sally. I skimmed through it quickly and pressed the intercom on my desk. Colette, can you check if Beatrice is in the building and ask her to come to my office as soon as possible? Yes, sir. I believe she's in her office. I saw her earlier and she hasn't left since. A few minutes later, Bea arrived at my door. Without a word, I passed the letter to her. As she read it, I noticed her taking several deep breaths, a clear sign that the contents had angered her. That vindictive little witch. Did you have any clue? Not at all. What are you going to do about it? Come on, Bea. I don't have a choice. Then, turning to June Parsons, I asked, which hospital is Sally in? Slough General. And do you know what the prognosis is? When I visited last night, they weren't sure. She had taken a mix of prohibited substances, pretty much everything she had at home. They pumped her stomach, but they have no idea how long she had been there. The doctor mentioned it would be some time before they can give a clear prognosis. And the children? I placed them with an emergency foster mother last night. She'll care for them today. I thought I'd ask you what you want to do. Oh, and I need to take that note back. If she doesn't make it, the coroner will need to see it. Not a problem, Bea. Make a copy for me and then return the original to Miss Parsons here. Colette, get the general manager of Slough Hospital on the line ASAP. The intercom buzzed again. A few moments later, the phone rang. Hello? Yes, good, you know who I am. I have a question for you. How much is your hospital over budget this year? Okay, here's the deal. You have a patient there named Sally. Wait, June, what's Sally's last name? Same as yours, Crawford, June Parson answered. That was unexpected. Right, you have a patient named Sally Crawford, admitted for a prohibited substances overdose. If she pulls through, your hospital will receive a check from me for £1 million. If she doesn't, you get nothing. Got it? Good. I want no corners cut, no expenses spared. Goodbye. They must be doing everything they can already, Bea remarked. I don't trust the bureaucrats running our hospitals these days. You hear too often about cost cutting. I just wonder sometimes. But waving £1 million in front of them can't hurt, and I'm sure now they'll do everything possible for Sally. All right. Now let's go pick up my kids. I assume that's why you came here in the first place, June. Well, Mrs. Crawford claims they're your children in this letter. I don't see any harm in letting you take care of them for now. But you understand that, until a judge decides otherwise, they are my responsibility. You don't need to worry. They'll be well taken care of, and I'll keep you updated on everything. With your permission, we'll take them to my house near Swindon. There's plenty to keep them busy there until we know what's going to happen with Sally. We can drive up the motorway in about an hour to visit her in the hospital. I'm glad to hear you're thinking that way, Mr. Crawford. Come on. We started this conversation with John and June. The children will likely feel more comfortable if we keep it that way. The three of us headed to the basement car park, with Miss Parsons joining Bea and me in the back of my limousine for the drive to Slough. We first stopped at the hospital to check on Sally. The doctors were hesitant to make any predictions at what they referred to as this early stage. June Parsons then guided us to the foster home where the children were staying. Bea and I remained in the car while she went in alone to speak to the children first. 10 minutes later, she signaled for me to join her, and Bea followed me inside. "Kay and Heather, this is your Uncle John. He'll be looking after you until your mother feels better," June explained to them. We had agreed to use Uncle John until we knew more about Sally's condition and how the girls would respond to me. "Hi, girls. This is my friend Beatrice, but you can call her Auntie B." The two 10-year-olds eyed Bea and me with some suspicion. "Until your mommy gets better, you're going to stay with your Uncle John at his home in the country. I think you'll like it there. He has horses you can ride, and the house has its own swimming pool," Bea added. "Where is our mother? Can we see her?" Kay asked. "Is she going to die?" Heather asked. "The doctors are doing everything they can to prevent that," I assured them. The girls still looked wary. "We saw her a little while ago, but if you'd like, we can stop at the hospital, and you can see for yourselves how hard they're working to make her well again." "They might not allow the children to see her," June pointed out. "They'll let these children see their mother, I assure you. Just remember those pound signs," I replied. We dropped June off at the station where she'd left her car when she came to visit me in town. After that, we headed to the hospital. As I anticipated, the rules were relaxed to allow the girls into the ICU. The girls didn't cry as I thought they would. In fact, they turned out to be quite tough. Bea even mentioned that they looked a lot like me. At that moment, I decided to forget about the DNA tests I had planned. The drive down to Wiltshire was pretty quiet. Once the girls got comfortable in the limo, they started playing with everything they could find. The idea of watching TV while driving down the motorway was completely new to them. As we exited the motorway, Heather turned to me and asked, "You're our father, aren't you?" I saw no reason to deny it. "Yes, I believe I am. But I need to tell you that I didn't know until today. If I had known, you would have seen much more of me." "We know. Mummy told us last week that she never told you about us. We didn't know what she was planning, but she said she had been really mean to you and never told you that you were our dad. She said you thought her other husband was our father," Heather continued. "She was crying," Kay added. "That's true. Maybe one day your mother will explain why she did what she did." "Do you think she's going to get better then?" Kay asked. "Well, I certainly hope so." "She doesn't want to get better. She wants to go to heaven," Heather said. "I can't believe that, especially with two wonderful children like you," Bea replied. "Mummy's tired. She works so hard and there's never enough money." "Well, there will be now, and she definitely won't have to work anymore. See that little house over there?" The car was just entering the grounds of my estate. "When she gets better, I'm going to ask your mother if she would like to live in that house. You two will be able to ride horses here and swim in the pool at the big house." The two girls' eyes widened as they stared at the mansion where the car had stopped. The house staff hurried down the steps to greet them, and I could tell that preparations had been rushed for the girls' arrival. One of the guest rooms, equipped with twin beds, had been prepared for them. It felt like Bea and I were forgotten as the staff fussed over the girls and quickly escorted them away. "Well, that's unexpected," Bea said. "I wonder why she never told you they were yours." "Oh, Sally must have gone to great lengths to hide her pregnancy from me. Now that I think about it, she probably was showing during that last meeting when we signed the divorce papers. I remember she was sitting at the table, kind of hunched over, wearing a long coat. It struck me as odd, given how nice the weather was that day. I wonder why she despised me so much. After all, she was the one who cheated on me. How else did she expect me to react when I found out she was sleeping with that jerk? You'll have to ask her, assuming she pulls through." The children seemed to settle in well, enjoying all the attention from the house staff. Every night, I would tuck them in and share stories about their mother and my life together, though I avoided talking about the last year. 2 weeks later, I entered the room where Sally was sleeping. She had woken up in a clear state of mind for the first time the evening before. I placed the letter she had left in her hand and waited for her to wake up. I must have dozed off while waiting. The first thing I heard was, "Hello, John. I'm sorry." I looked over at her and saw she was staring at the letter in her hand. "How are my girls?" "They're fine. I left them at the swimming pool this morning. I can tell you they're wearing my staff out. They are two lovely girls, a real credit to you. B will bring them here this afternoon." "Thank you. I'm sorry I hid them from you. It was a foolish thing I did out of anger, but once it was done, I didn't know how to undo it." "Well, I couldn't imagine a worse way to handle it than the one you chose." "I'm sorry, but I was desperate. You know I owe thousands of pounds that I just can't repay. Robert left me with so many debts. He had me sign for everything. I think that's why he married me, because as a bankrupt, he couldn't get any credit." "You have no debts now, Sally. I've cleared them all, and those loan sharks you borrowed from are out of business permanently. Oh, you found out about them. That wasn't hard. They showed up at your flat demanding money, while one of my staff was collecting the rest of the girls' things. He told them to come back later, and, well, I think they were in for a bit of a surprise when they did. Rest assured they'll never bother you again. Why are you being so nice to me? The last time you saw me, That was a long time ago, Sally, and I was still hurting then. Now it's just an unhappy memory. But I was deeply hurt when I read your letter. It's going to take me a long time to forgive you for keeping my girls from me. I'm sorry. That's all I can say. Well, as far as the girls know, we're just friends now. Tomorrow, if you're okay with it, you'll be moved to my house. I've arranged for a couple of nurses to take care of you there. Once you've fully recovered, you and the girls can live in one of the estate houses. That way I can see them often. You're not going to take the children from me. I'm not going to take their mother away from my girls, no. They love you, maybe even more than I did once. But I'll make sure you never take them away from me again. I'm sorry. I keep saying that, but I truly regret all the foolish things I've done. There's something I have to ask you, Sally. Why did you go with that lousy creep in the first place? Don't you think I've asked myself that 1,000 times over the last 10 years? I'm not sure I have an answer. He worked on me very carefully over a long period. Oh, I know why he did it. He told me when he realized the girls weren't his. It didn't take him long. They look so much like you. He said they couldn't fire you because of something in their father's will. They were convinced you had some of their father's money. They thought that without a job, you'd use it to start your own business or something. They had private detectives watching you all the time. They were really upset when you went to Southampton and met up with Simon Johnson. Then a week later, the company's 4 biggest contracts were canceled, including Johnson's. But you knew that was going to happen, didn't you? I think the bank foreclosing on them caught them by surprise. They didn't see that coming. The next thing I knew, the police showed up at our house. Did you know that Robert charged nearly everything to the company? We were left with nothing. No house, no car, nothing. Robert and Tony were arrested for misusing company funds. But I have a feeling you were behind all that. No, Sally. The law took its course without any interference from me. But Robert and Tony were earning ridiculous salaries. What did they do with all that money? I'm not entirely sure. They were both into playing the stock market, and Robert spent money like it was nothing at the clubs. He wasn't shy about gambling either. I think they blew it all, and then came up with the plan to get you out of the company. They were banking on you revealing where they thought Henry had hidden away a fortune. You still haven't explained why you went along with that jerk. Well, I was furious with you. Robert was very manipulative. He completely fooled me. Every time you went away, he'd drop little hints. He'd let me overhear conversations that made me think you had girlfriends everywhere. It's hard to describe, but I'd hear him talking with Tony about expenses you'd supposedly incurred for nightclubs and other things. Oh, I'm sure those expenses were legitimate. But it was the little comments he'd make to Tony over the phone, things I wasn't supposed to hear, but of course he made sure I did. You know, guy talk. He'd say things like, you had a new girl in New York or Rome, and you'd spent a lot of money on her. They had me completely convinced that whenever you had a trip, it was to meet up with one of your girlfriends. But if you thought I was cheating on you, why didn't you confront me? Because I couldn't bear to believe it. If I had confronted you and you admitted it was true, what would I have done then? I wasn't as strong as you. I don't think I could have just walked away and divorced you. I would have been miserable. But over time, I started to doubt my belief. And then that play came up. You knew I wanted you to take me. Robert was there when you called to say you were going to New York. He heard our conversation, and when I started crying, he comforted me. He drove me home to get your bag, and then to the airport. We didn't go back to work. Robert said I was too upset, so we went down to the river at Sunnydale and spent the afternoon talking. Later, he took me out for a meal and to the play that night. I must have had too much to drink. I know it's no excuse, but that night I ended up sleeping with him. I'm sure I wouldn't have done it if I hadn't been drinking, but it's easy to say that now. I was feeling really low, and Robert made me feel good about myself that day. After all, I thought my supposedly loving husband had just flown off to see his girlfriend. At least, that's what I believed. I kept thinking that until Robert left me. He told me everything about how they had set it up. If you hadn't come home that day, they had photos of Robert and me together, which they were going to send to you anonymously. I knew it was wrong to sleep with Robert, and if it makes you feel any better, he wasn't very good in bed. Too selfish. I don't want to know that, Sally. I'm sorry, but it's true. He was useless at just about everything, except hitting me. He got pretty good at that towards the end. When you came back and found Robert and me together, I was angry. I'm not sure why, but I felt like you had set me up. That girl told me you weren't coming home until Sunday. That little tart. Petra. Yes, Petra. I was sure she was your affair over there. Well, she wasn't. Don't you think I realize that now? But at the time, I thought you were setting me up so you could catch me and divorce me. It made me furious. Honestly, I think I was mostly angry at myself. I planned to tell you about the twins on the day we signed the divorce papers. My idea was to sign them first, and then, before you did, I'd mention the babies. That way, it wouldn't seem like I was using them to change your mind or get you to take me back. You would have had the choice to sign or not. But you were still mad at me. Looking back, I think that's when I should have realized you hadn't been cheating on me. If you had, you wouldn't have been so angry at me for doing the same. But you called me something awful, and I lost my temper. I'm sorry. Stop saying you're sorry. What's done is done, and nothing can change that. Will you ever forgive me? Forgive you? That's a big question. Maybe I'll forgive you eventually, but I'll never forget. But now there are two lovely little girls to consider, and I, or rather we, have to think about them. I'll be civil to you, and I expect you to do the same. As far as the girls are concerned, you're their mother and I'll be their loving father. Just don't bring any boyfriends around my house. There have never been any boyfriends, and there never will be. Ever is a long time, Sally. Sally eventually recovered to some extent and lived with the girls in the small house on the estate until they left for university. She passed away from cancer a couple of years ago. I don't think she had the strength to put up much of a fight. I'm certain the prohibited substances she took during that overdose caused some lasting damage. In the end, Bea and I got married. Do we love each other? Well, I don't think I love Beatrice the same way I loved Sally. Bea and I are more like soulmates. We care deeply for each other and enjoy being intimate. I suppose it is love, but it's different from what I felt for Sally. The twins are now grown, married, and have children of their own. Bea has taken on the role of grandma, though I believe she feels too young for the title. Am I happy now? Yes and no. I wish I could have spent my life with the woman I truly loved. Now, all I can do is place flowers on her grave. Every Sunday, Beatrice waits at the cemetery gate while I do this. Life goes on.